So here we're going to go through a little drawing comparing parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Hopefully this will help things make a little more sense. So first, with parasympathetic nervous system, we're just going to go through kind of the general functions. So it increases, actually first, let's just say this is rest and digest. So when you're resting and digesting, you increase digestion, urination, and the pupils constrict. So pupils constrict during parasympathetic activation because you don't need as much light coming in because you don't need to see as well to run away from the bear or the danger. We decrease heart rate, blood pressure, sweat, and then these neurons originate in the brain and sacrum. The sympathetic nervous system is called the fight or flight. This system increases heart rate, blood pressure, sweat, and blood glucose. We need blood glucose, blood sugar, provides energy for muscles. We decrease digestion and urination. The pupils dilate so that you can get more light into the eyes so that you can see better. Cells originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions. So next we're going to do a little bit of a drawing. So bear with me here on the quality of some of my drawings. So we have this part here. This is the spinal cord. If you guys haven't done your lab stuff yet, you won't really understand what this looks like, but you will in a second. And then down here, the effector organ we're going to use is the heart. This is not anatomically correct. And then on the sympathetic side, the sympathetic chain ganglion is where the nerve synapse is pretty close to the spinal cord. On the parasympathetic side, the ganglion are pretty close to the effector cell organs. See, I added a few labels in case my drawing skills aren't good enough. So we'll start here on the sympathetic side. So the way that this is laid out, the cell body is in the spinal cord, and it has its little dendrites, and it sends an axon to the sympathetic chain ganglion. It has its little axon terminals here that secrete acetylcholine, and that synapses with the cell body of another neuron that sends an axon to the effector organ, where it secretes norepinephrine. So the preganglionic neuron is myelinated. So we draw these little bubbles of myelin. It's pretty short. It's close to the sympathetic chain ganglion. And then the postganglionic neuron here is not myelinated, and it is pretty long. So I added some labels. The preganglionic neuron is short and myelinated. Postganglionic neuron is long and not myelinated. The neurotransmitter being used here is acetylcholine that we abbreviate ACH. And then the neurotransmitter here is norepinephrine that we abbreviate NE. The receptors on the effector organ are called adrenergic receptors. And the receptors here on the cell body of the postganglionic neuron are nicotinic receptors. Here I added some labels. You can see the neurotransmitter being used right here is acetylcholine, and the receptors are nicotinic. Here on the effector organ, neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, and then the receptors are adrenergic, so those alpha-beta receptors. Okay, we'll go through the parasympathetic side now. So on the parasympathetic side, you can see the ganglion is much further away from the spinal cord. The cell body starts in the spinal cord, and it sends a long myelinated axon to the part where it synapses with the postsynaptic or postganglionic neuron, its nucleus, and it sends a short axon to the effector organ where it meets with the effector organ. So the preganglionic neuron here is also myelinated. So we can draw our little bubbles here too to indicate that there's myelin. So the preganglionic neuron is long and myelinated, and it secretes a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. So this is ACH, which binds to the receptors on the postganglionic cell body that are nicotinic receptors. The postganglionic neuron is short, not myelinated, and it secretes acetylcholine that binds to muscarinic receptors. So you can see I added some lines here, some labels here to show the neurotransmitter being used here in the ganglion is acetylcholine, and then the receptor on the cell body is nicotinic. And then over here, the neurotransmitter being released is acetylcholine, and it binds to a muscarinic receptor. So because different neurotransmitters and receptors are being used, that is how we can have different effects. So for example, acetylcholine is used in sympathetic and parasympathetic. So how does it have a different effect? That doesn't really make sense. It's the same neurotransmitter. The difference is it can bind to nicotinic receptors or muscarinic receptors. So when it binds to a muscarinic receptor, it does things differently than when it binds to a nicotinic receptor. Okay? There are lots of medications that can be used in these systems. So you could block acetylcholine from being released here on the sympathetic side. If you block the sympathetic side, you block all this. So the result is increased digestion, urination, and the pupils constrict. There are medications that can block nicotinic receptors on the parasympathetic side. If you block parasympathetic, you get an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, sweat, you get a sympathetic activation. You can use medications to cause a release of more norepinephrine. You can have medications that block adrenergic receptors, like a beta blocker. A lot of you are probably familiar with beta blockers used for heart failure. So if you block the beta receptor, you block the sympathetic activation. So the result is a decrease in heart rate and blood pressure. These medications are used to lower blood pressure and to decrease the contractility of the heart. Okay, so medications can work all throughout this. If you're able to draw this picture for yourself, definitely do that, and you'll be able to understand how a lot of different medications are able to work and be used. But that's it for this drawing.